you lousy Florida gardener here. Today we're going to visit the Hampton Springs Hotel. In the early 19th century, these spas and resorts across Florida, like the one we're going to look at here today, the Hampton Springs Hotel and Grounds. But now you have to understand that in that time, these spas and mineral springs were referred to as having healing powers. People come from all over. The particular one that we're going to look at here today on the creek banks of the Rocky Creek River here in Taylor County, Florida, is the Hampton Springs Hotel. And you have to keep in mind that in much of our country at that time, and especially in this southern area, at that time, most homes didn't even have electricity in them, much less running water. So these spas offered all the finest amenities that money could buy. And the wealthy came here, both by boat and train, because the roads were not improved at that time, what few roads that there were. The hotel was accessible by as many as 10 trains on average coming through a day. Or you could access it here at this ferry. I could not find any pictures of it during its heyday, but I did, however, find descriptions. According to the descriptions, you would have pulled into a covered canopy surrounded by tropical and exotic plants as you'd have pulled in. But there were, however, some pictures of what would have been the Grand Resort and the hotel, which would have stood back here. The image that you're looking at is what you would have been seeing. According to folklore, Mr. Joe Hamilton was passing through this area and his wife was sick, suffering from the effects of rheumatism. He was instructed by local Indians here to visit a local spring and to give her some of that water. So that's what he did, and after she was miraculously healed, Mr. Hamilton purchased a land grant from the state of Florida for $10 for a piece of property right up the creek from here. That is supposedly what got interest started in the healing waters of these surrounding areas. And folklore goes on to say that the word of this miraculous healing had spread, word that those waters were also located here, and attracted the interest of the Hampton brothers. Now, all of that is not known whether to be fact or not. What is known to be a fact is that in 1879, Joseph and Benjamin Hampton purchased this piece of property right up the creek from where Mr. Hamilton's property was. Purchased it for the sum of $400 from John and Ann Carlton. With this piece of property and $20,000 starting finances, they started what would become known as the Hampton Springs Hotel and Mineral Company. This bridge that you see here was put in by the county as more of a recreation. The original walkover bridge and drive-over bridge that would have been here to service some of the many amenities that was here access across this creek would have run on this concrete pedestal. To keep from destroying the past even more, they just built a new one right beside it. Whether that is photo accurate or not, I'm not sure. I haven't been able to find any surviving images of the actual bridge that crossed it. In 1908, when the doors was open of the Hampton Springs Hotel, looked nothing like what you see here today. Where what is now is debris and nothing more than memories, once stood one of the finest spas with amenities where the believers could come and bask in a pool. This pool would have been fed by a wading pool. This is actually the sulfur spring that comes up out of the center. If you look, you can see that is tile in the bottom apparently, or else etched concrete. Would have been ornate. The pool you're looking at here would have been covered. It would have been an indoor pool. And just to give you an idea, you can see on the backdrop where the walls would have come up. If you look here and here, on both sides of the wading pool would have been the entrances into your pool area. And here on your wading pool, you would have had benches around the edges to a set with your accessible walkways. Now over here, where you see these stones, we're going to step over there and I'll tell you a little about that. Overlooking the river, on the side of your covered pool, would have been bathhouses. At one time, the county had uncovered these. They had to cover them back up due to vandalism. You can still see the concrete remnants sticking out of the ground. just for a reference point, this would have been your covered pool. As water flowed out into the pool, excess water from the pool, that mineral enriched water had an overflow pipe that would have flowed back out into the river and returned that mineral sulfur enriched water back into nature. As we can see clearly evident from the pictures, this magnificent structure that you see behind me here looked nothing like its remnants of today. So we can tell by the pictures, as you can see, the families coming. I mean, different youth camps coming, showing up in droves of numbers from areas all over by the pictures that we have left in the archive. It was more than just a fly-by-night in its heyday. And getting here was no problem. The train company made sure of that, and the ferry service. So let's take a step up and we'll see what amenities they had. We'll start here with this nice goldfish pond, which had a sprinkler in it as you step up what would have been a grand staircase. The goldfish pond in Mortar Garden. Today it's broken and mangled. In its day, it would have supported large goldfish plants, water plants. In the center there would have been a mineral filled fountain. Waters would have been flowing from. And then behind it here would have stood our motel. Interior of this goldfish pond was made of solid pavers and then coated for the outside decorative look and rimmed with edging much like this. Although a lot of the concrete sidewalks remain, to make access easier, when this was reclaimed by the county and the park was built, they put in these etched sidewalks. As you'd have walked the grounds and the sidewalks, you'd have noticed in the sidewalks the etching. Sidewalks were ornate, not just basic concrete. All around the grounds, as would have been on these originally, would have been structures and statues, concrete urns that would have been mounted into the sidewalks, exotic flowers, plants. The mind can only imagine what you would have been stepping into. This would have been the covered pool area and the fountain. The exotic plants would have been here in what is now took over by an ancient oak. Here we'd have been walking down the covered porches of the hotel, of the resort spa. Rocking chairs would have dotted our way. Children perhaps running down the sidewalks as we'd have walked past the magnificent hotel grounds. Hotel rooms that would have sat here would have been adorned with the finest linen and all of the best furnishings available to the wealthy. One can only imagine what sounds you would have been surrounded by with your stay here. Certainly would not have been the vehicles that you can hear in the background today or the planes that fly overhead. Would have more than likely been the sound of logging going on upriver at the Rocky Creek Lumber Yard, or it could have possibly been the trains in the background bringing and taking guests from the resort. You may have heard the blow of the whistle from the ferry coming up the river, and no doubt it would have been different. In this room they would have created power. This is where all the power was created to feed the amenities and many people coming here. So that's just a bit of interesting information. Not only did it contain a golf course, horse riding stables, trails, everything that was used here was produced here on the place. So whether it was the hunting and fishing for the men from the hunting and fishing lodge, or gambling at the casino on the weekend, or children basking in the pools, there was plenty here to do. You could go ride your horses at the stables or lease a horse. You could play golf, tennis courts on site. I mean, the amenities were just flourishing, and that's part of the reason why it survived a lot older than others. Another critical reason for that was the buy-in of Mr. J.W. Oglesby, who had already owned White Sulphur Springs at the time, Spa and Resort. It was in his best interest due to the fact that his trains is what they were riding on here. So it was set up to flourish. Amenities, you could even buy this mineral healing water and have it shipped to your home or take it back with you from the water bottling company that was here on site. They bottled it right here and shipped it all over the country. But as fate would have it, colliding with the opening of the Hampton Springs Hotel, the stock market panic of 1907 and 1908 set in. For those of you who's not familiar with that, the stock market fell by over 50% in those years, due largely in part to manipulation of the copper stocks by the Knickerbocker Foundation. Thankfully, that was headed off by an intervention from J.P. Morgan and Company, and shortly thereafter, the Federal Reserve of the United States was formed, and that was helped head off. But it was too late. The panic was already done. People in America had went into that panic and worried about not having no money. So in the South, these mineral spas and resorts, everything kind of come to a halt. Mr. Oglesby was a man of entrepreneurship. Being the president and manager of the railroad, he had strong belief that the market would recover now that people understood it didn't crash and been propped up, and that the tourists would return. So much like the White Sulphur Springs Spa and Resort that he bought in with the Hamptons here in 1915, inducted a lot of cash. Renovations were immediately performed. Everything was starting to turn around. The people in America were relaxing, returning to what they happened, and then all of a sudden, another twisted turn of fate. In 1929, the stock markets crashed. I don't have to tell you, you know if you've studied any of American history at all, that some of the wealthy killed themselves. They couldn't deal with it. These things come to a crashing halt. I sometimes wonder if Mr. Oglesby didn't have a predecessor of knowing that was coming. Because just 2 years before that famous crash, Mr. Oglesby, without ever any explanation or understanding or any reasoning, leased his shares to Mr. Arnold Joarnes for 99 years. Mr. Joarnes, much like Mr. Oglesby, had planned on cashing in with the return of the tourists after the panic, had no way of knowing what was coming, invested his money, converted this place and induced cash into it, and it became the official, or the elite, Hampton Springs Clubhouse. And it was going to be for members only. After the crash, there was no recovery for these spas. This one held on longer than most due to the large number of amenities that had been influenced in by the railroad tycoon and by Mr. Joarnes. After that, it was leased and run by several people, become really more of a boarding and bedding, set empty at long periods of time in between. So inhabited by vagrants throughout time. In the 1930s and 1940s, it was used for housing troops that were training here at the Army Air Base preparing for World War II. Not a whole lot of documentation after that time. The hotel partially burned down and was gutted in 1954. Lots of people believe it was accidentally set by homeless that was living there, not intentional. After that, it sat in disrepair for years. It was used for garbage dumping. People dumped garbage here. Used to be one trail coming in, which people would stop up the pool and swim in the pool during the summer, swim in the creek, fishing in the creek. County finally come in and put in the part that you see before you today. So I hope now maybe you got a little better understanding of the background and the history of the Hampton Springs, and there's no reason to be sad when you think of it closing and not being rebuilt. It had run its era. Society and times would not allow it to function anymore because of the change in American culture and the American financial system. But during its day, it was a glorious place. Not only brought people from other places, but with all the jobs and everything produced on site, employed lots of local people. Children from clubs and schools all around attended camps here, seminars here. So when you think of this, think of a happy place. So I hope you understand a little more now about the Taylor County history of the Hampton Springs, and it'll induce you to maybe do some research on your own. These are just the facts that I could dig up and opinions that I had read and found. I appreciate y'all joining me.